There's one track from Highway to Hell that AC/DC has never performed on stage. The reason is at a crime scene. On March 17, 1985, in Rosemead, California, a suburb of LA, police arrived at a home where two women had been attacked. One was dead, the other had just barely survived, badly shaken and traumatized. Investigators processed this scene carefully, collecting every trace of physical evidence they could. Among the evidence, they found a black baseball cap with the letters spelling out AC/DC across the front. At the time, it seemed like just another piece of evidence. Nobody knew yet that this hat would connect one of the world's biggest rock bands to a serial killer forever. Detectives began comparing the details with other recent attacks across the region. At the time, they knew they were dealing with a serial killer, but they didn't yet know his identity. The real break came months later at another crime scene, where investigators recovered a clear fingerprint left behind by the attacker. The print was entered into the police database and matched to a suspect with a prior arrest record. For the first time, the case had an identity attached to it. The man behind the attacks finally had a name, Richard Ramirez, and he was AC/DC's biggest fan. Richard Ramirez was born in El Paso, Texas in 1960. He had a rough childhood with a violent father, but the real damage came from his cousin Miguel, a Vietnam War veteran with schizophrenia. Miguel bragged about war crimes and showed Richard graphic photos from Vietnam. When Richard was 15 years old, he watched Miguel shoot his wife Jessie in the face during an argument. After witnessing that murder, Richard went to live with his sister Ruth and her husband Roberto. Roberto had a habit of sneaking around neighborhoods at night, looking into windows and watching people when they thought they were alone. Roberto started taking Richard along with him on these nighttime excursions, teaching the teenager how to move through the shadows without being detected. By his teenage years, Richard was drawing pentagrams on his body and talking constantly about Satan. This wasn't the typical teenage rebellion. Richard had developed a genuine fascination with Satanism and the occult. He dropped out of high school and eventually moved to Los Angeles, where he committed burglaries to finance his coke addiction. When Richard was 19, he discovered AC/DC's Highway to Hell album. The album had been released in 1979 and was already controversial. The title upset religious groups, and the cover artwork showed Angus Young with devil horns. But for Richard Ramirez, this album became an obsession. One track in particular spoke to him in a way nothing else ever had. Night Prowler was the final song on Highway to Hell. The song opened with 2 deep breaths designed to create fear and dread. Then came this slow, menacing blues rhythm.
Too scared to turn your light out, 'cause there's something on your mind. Was that a noise outside the window?
People who knew him later said he listened to AC/DC frequently, especially Night Prowler. Ramirez had the training, the obsession, and now he had the soundtrack. And what happened next would terrorize an entire state. Ramirez started killing people. Between June 1984 and August 1985, he killed 13 people and was responsible for 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. His youngest victim was 6 years old. His oldest was 83. His first confirmed murder was Jenny Vincow in June 1984. After her death, he waited 9 months before attacking again. But when he resumed in March 1985, the violence was fast and furious. He would break into homes through unlocked windows or doors that hadn't been secured properly. Sometimes he would shoot his victims, sometimes he would beat them with whatever he found in the house, and sometimes he would do both. What made Ramirez particularly terrifying was the randomness of his victim selection. He didn't have a type. Young, old, male, female, it didn't matter. He would case neighborhoods, watching homes until he found the one that looked vulnerable. According to later reports, Ramirez would hum Night Prowler while stalking through these neighborhoods. The song's opening lines about midnight and shadows moving through the darkness became his personal anthem. Some investigators later wondered if he hummed that melody while breaking into homes, if those slow blues notes played in his head as he approached sleeping victims. The song talks about slipping into rooms undetected, and Ramirez seemed to be living out every word. Maybe it was the line about not being seen or felt that connected with him most. The idea of being invisible until it was too late. At several crime scenes, he left behind pentagrams drawn in lipstick or blood. He would force some victims to swear to Satan before attacking them. On March 27th, a married couple was attacked in their home in Whittier. The husband was shot first. Then the wife was brutally beaten and mutilated. Police found that distinctive obvious shoe print at the scene. They also had composite sketches from survivors showing a man with long, curly dark hair, rotting teeth, and bulging eyes. But they still didn't have a name, and the attacks kept coming. The breakthrough came from technology. After one attack, investigators lifted a fingerprint from a stolen car Ramirez had used and abandoned. California had just implemented a new computerized fingerprint matching system. When they ran the print through the database, it came back with a match. Richard Ramirez, previously arrested for auto theft, was their man. Police finally had a name and a face for the Night Stalker. On August 29, 1985, police released Ramirez's mugshot to the media. They announced that they knew exactly who the Night Stalker was and that soon everyone would know his face. Ramirez was completely unaware his identity had been revealed, but the whole world was about to watch him get caught in the most unexpected way possible. In 1985, Ramirez had taken a bus to Tucson to visit his brother. When he arrived, he discovered his brother wasn't home, so he planned to return the next day. On August 31st, Ramirez walked into a small market in East Los Angeles. People inside began staring at him. At first, he assumed it was because he was an outsider in the neighborhood. Then, someone recognized his face from the news coverage and shouted that he was the Night Stalker. Ramirez ran. He tried to steal a car from a woman loading groceries, but her husband came out with a metal bar and hit Ramirez in the head. Other neighbors heard the commotion and joined the chase. They tackled him and held him down until police arrived. When police took Ramirez into custody, and later during his confession, LAPD Sergeant George Thomas testified that Ramirez was humming a song. It was Night Prowler. The arrest made international headlines, and that's when the full story about Ramirez's obsession with AC/DC came out. Ray Garcia, who had grown up with Ramirez in El Paso, confirmed to reporters that his childhood friend had been a massive AC/DC fan. The media immediately connected the dots between Ramirez's nickname, the Night Stalker, and AC/DC's song, Night Prowler. But to understand why this connection caused such massive controversy, you need to understand what America was like in 1985. This was the peak of satanic panic. People across the country believed that devil worshippers were everywhere, corrupting children and driving people to commit terrible crimes. It had started in 1980 with a book called Michelle Remembers, where a woman claimed she had recovered memories of being abused by satanic cults as a child. The book became a bestseller despite being completely fabricated. Daycare centers across America were accused of ritual satanic abuse. The McMartin preschool trial in California became the longest and most expensive criminal trial in U.S. history. Parents accused teachers of molesting children during satanic rituals. The case went on for years before all charges were dropped because there was no evidence. But the fear had already spread. Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and the Green River Killer dominated news coverage. All this just fed into satanic panic. When Richard Ramirez was arrested and his connection to AC/DC was revealed, it seemed to confirm everything religious groups had been saying. Here was a serial killer who loved heavy metal, drew pentagrams on his body, openly identified as a Satanist, and his nickname matched his favorite AC/DC song. Religious groups pointed to the song's themes as proof of its dangerous influence. Night Prowler described moving through darkness at midnight, slipping into rooms undetected, the idea of being invisible until it was too late. To parents already terrified of satanic influence, Richard Ramirez's murder spree looked like a direct result of the music he liked listening to. Newspaper headlines screamed sensationalized stories. Some falsely claimed Ramirez had admitted that AC/DC's music made him a killer. Others suggested the band's music had radicalized him. Rumors spread that AC/DC stood for Antichrist Devil's Child, which was completely made up, because the letters actually came from Malcolm and Angus Young seeing AC/DC on their sister's sewing machine, where it stood for alternating current and direct current. They thought the name symbolized raw electrical power, but the opposite happened. Some AC/DC shows faced protest and public pressure, and controversy followed the band for a time. Some families of Ramirez's victims filed lawsuits against the band. AC/DC found themselves blamed for murders they had nothing to do with. But what is Night Prowler actually about? This question became critical because people needed to know whether AC/DC had written a song about stalking and murder. AC/DC has always maintained the song was never about murder. Band members later explained that Night Prowler was meant to reflect teenage sneaking, not violence. There's another detail about supporting this explanation. At the very end of the song, after all the dark atmosphere, Bon Scott mutters Shazbot Nanu Nanu, the catchphrase from Mork and Mindy. Would a song genuinely about murder end with a comedy show reference? But here's the problem. Night Prowler sounds menacing and predatory. Bon Scott sings it in a way that makes the words sound threatening. Some people think the band came up with the innocent explanation after the Ramirez connection made them desperate to distance themselves from the controversy. Maybe the song was already darker than they're willing to admit. Or maybe they genuinely intended it to be about teenage mischief, but deliberately created a menacing atmosphere because that made for better rock music. Either way, Night Prowler sounds dangerous and threatening, which is probably why Ramirez connected with it so strongly. The question everyone was asking in 1985 was whether Night Prowler had inspired Richard Ramirez to commit murder. Did AC/DC's music turn him into a serial killer? The evidence says no. Ramirez was damaged in ways that had nothing to do with rock music. He was physically abused and started using substances at a young age. All of this happened before he ever heard Highway to Hell. His interest in Satanism also predated AC/DC by years. He was drawing pentagrams as a teenager, long before the album was released. During his trial, Ramirez's behavior showed his satanic image was central to his identity in ways unrelated to music. He carved a pentagram into his palm and showed it to the jury. He shouted out "Hail Satan" in court. He gave speeches about being beyond good and evil, about legions of the night, about Lucifer dwelling in all of us. These were the words of someone who'd built his entire persona around evil and fear. Ramirez himself thought the AC/DC connection was overblown. In prison statements, he said the world had been fed many lies about him. He claimed serial killers are a product of their times. Even the killer suggested that blaming AC/DC was missing the point, but it would obviously be very stupid to trust the word of a serial killer. A man who casually murders 13 people is not going to draw the line at lying. But if we look at less biased sources, we see the same thing. Research studies show serial killers have severe psychological damage that develops long before cultural influences matter. Many demonstrate psychopathic behavior from a very young age. Music or movies might provide a framework and a vocabulary for someone like this to express his evil desires, but they don't create the evil. So Night Prowler didn't inspire Ramirez to become a serial killer. The song didn't cause him to murder, but it probably gave him a soundtrack and a persona. It said what he was thinking. It provided imagery and language that fit the identity he had already constructed in his head. But that didn't matter. The song was tarnished. Being known as a murder anthem is terrible PR. The controversy hit AC/DC hard. Malcolm Young said when he first heard about the Ramirez connection, he thought it was a joke. The band was blindsided. They had written a rock song 6 years earlier, and suddenly they were being accused of inspiring murder. Brian Johnson, who would replace Bon Scott after his death in 1980, said the whole situation made him sick. Angus Young stated that people who thought AC/DC were Satanists didn't understand the band. He said if they were really interested in devil worship, they would have pursued that seriously instead of just playing rock music. The band repeatedly denied being Satanists or having any connection to the occult, but given AC/DC's already edgy image at the time, convincing the fundies was impossible. In the wake of the case, AC/DC made a decision that has lasted over 40 years. They would never play Night Prowler live. Highway to Hell was released in 1979. Since then, AC/DC has toured constantly, performing thousands of shows worldwide. They've played nearly every song from their catalog at some point, but not Night Prowler. Sometimes, the darkest stories about music have nothing to do with the artist and everything to do with the people listening. If you want to see how tragedy touched another band in an unexpected way, check out our video on musicians who predicted their own deaths.